Week, like I said, kind of mostly talk about the high Middle Ages. I'll get into today, which kind of high Middle Ages is kind of like around 1000, about 1300, and the Vikings kind of come in like just right before that, mostly around the 9th century. And then I'll kind of go through and talk about the Crusades, which kind of peak between the 11th and 13, kind of go up to the 14th century too, a little bit as well. We'll kind of get into that, those famous military campaigns that were done by the Catholic West and all that. So anyway, moving on, of course, today, like I said, I'm going to talk about the so-called Viking Age first. And of course, last time we had kind of started talking about the Carolingian Empire of Charlemagne, which, started to fall apart close to about pretty much the 9th, 10th century. It broke up after the Treaty of Verdun. We talked about how, I think it was Charlemagne's grandsons, the sons of Louis the Pious, broke it up. And then, of course, the Vikings start coming in around that same time, like close to about the really 9th, 10th century. Vikings come in, they take over parts of Europe. And kind of first talk about, the Viking period, like what exactly was the so-called Viking Age that came in. Well, the Viking Age actually goes back to the 8th century. They say the Vikings first struck at northern Scotland, like a place called Lindisfarne Island, where there was some kind of Christian monastery there. They sacked it. And then from there, they started attacking Europe, mostly I think around the 9th century after that. But the so-called Viking Age is mostly an age which is between the 9th and 11th centuries. I think 1066 might be about when it ended, more or less. And it's about the period of where you have all these so-called Scandinavian peoples that start pushing in to Europe, into the North Atlantic. And of course, the peoples later call them, of course, Vikings, which I'll kind of explain why they're called that in a second. But let me go ahead and show you a map of the region we're talking about, where the Vikings came out of. The Vikings came out of mostly, I guess, what would be 3 areas that we know today. Mostly, you got Norway, they talked about in the video. They got Sweden, of course, and then Denmark. So pretty much all these areas here, it's where they came. They also had the so-called Finns, or traditional European Finns, that were there a long time ago that were here. So pretty much from Norway to Finland is pretty much where all the Scandinavian peoples, of course, came out of. And then you can see they started spreading out of different parts of Europe, mostly Northern Europe. You can see they went into the Mediterranean Sea, went into the Black Sea, Caspian Sea, and then the Northern Atlantic also as well. I'll also get to it later, but they're into the later North America. They think the Vikings went there as well. Why were they called Viking? Viking is a derogatory name that the Christians called them, because you know about it, the people in Europe saw the Vikings as bandits, pirates, basically. That came in and attacked their cities, looted their towns, attacked coastal areas, and stuff like that. And so it's kind of this medieval stereotype that, they see later in Viking movies or Viking TV shows, which I think have become popular in the last so many years. Although, if you know about it, it's a myth. It's a myth that Vikings had horns on their helmets. I don't know if you know that or not. That's something that Hollywood kind of invented. I think most Vikings were great sailors. They were fishermen, but I think their most really main way of life was predominantly farming. Was what they mostly did. Of course, the other question I sometimes talk about as well, like why did the Vikings leave Scandinavia? What was the reasons for that? Well, there's multiple theories on why the Vikings left, like Norway and all those other areas in Scandinavia. I at least give you several reasons for it. One was they always talk about the so-called medieval warm period that happened in Europe. And there's like this climate change where Europe started to warm up. like where Greenland is, Iceland. They were able to go there and live there because it was more of a warmer climate. So that's definitely one reason I think why it happened. Overpopulation. That's another thing they think caused it. Too many people living in places like Norway or whatever. If you've ever been to Scandinavia, it's like mostly mountains and fjords and things like that. Hard to farm, some parts of Norway and all that. So a lot of them left to more plush areas, obviously, of Europe. Obviously, they wanted to raid and settle areas that were more prosperous, kind of like people wanted to go to the Roman Empire before, right? And then you can see new trade routes. If you go to that map, of course, a lot of them sought trade routes, like with the Far East, like Asia, also into the Black Sea region, where you can see down there where it says Byzantine Empire. So a lot of them wanted to kind of trade with the Byzantine Empire, which was prosperous. And then kind of the Black Sea Caspian area, you've got different, I guess, part of the Silk Road. You get Asian trade goods coming from east to west. They want to get in contact with that as well. So, and of course, I'll get to it later, more or less about the Vikings. But the Vikings were known for being great explorers. That's something they're known for. Might have been the first great explorers you really hear about in medieval times. Also, let's talk about religion as well, because the Viking culture was known for having different gods that they had. Of course, there's a famous image and idol, of course, of Odin. Odin, if you know about it, was the chief god of the Vikings. He was the god of the warriors. He lived in Viking heaven, which was called Valhalla. We've heard of that. He lived in this place called Asgard, which Asgard was this huge house or hall, I guess, where all the Vikings, when they would die, they would go there. And so it's kind of like heaven to everybody. And Odin is also, they sometimes call him Woden. I don't know if you know that or not. Woden, W-O-D-E-N, W-O-D-E-N, Woden, just where they get Wednesday from. The day of Wednesday. Wednesday actually means Odin's day. Because some of the days of the week, are actually named after the Viking gods. Like Thursday is named after Thor Day. And they also have Friday, which is Frey Day, which is named after one of the gods. So thank God for Frey Day, huh? Of course. So yeah, that's one of their chief gods. That's very famous. Also, they have Thor as well. Right here, Thor. And Thor, of course, you probably heard of that one, the chief son of Odin. Odin had a couple sons he had, and that's the most famous one. God of thunder, predominantly, lightning, storms, things like that. Thor, of course, was famous for brandishing a hammer as well. They've made a lot of, movies and TV shows also about him as well. So kind of one of the most popular of the different gods that they had. I don't have other images, but I'll kind of show you some other gods they had too. You may have heard of Balder. Balder was another son of Odin, like a brother of Thor. He was the so-called god of bravery, mostly, because that's something the Vikings kind of saw that was important. Bravery, like in battle. Beauty and light also as well, you can see. Frey, and also had Freya. Those were kind of twin brother and sisters. Frey was the fertility god in Viking lore. He was also the god of kingship. He had a sister, you can see Freya, who was associated with a lot of different things. Love, beauty, fertility, and sex. And Freya was kind of like a Viking version of Aphrodite or Venus. It's kind of similar. And they think some of their gods were kind of influenced by the Roman gods, or also maybe various German gods that were kind of popular throughout Europe. Loki, they sometimes talk about too, so-called trickster god, was the god of luck, fortune, and you can see, and also mischief as well. So these are all different Viking gods that they were famous for. However, over time, as they go from like the 10th to 11th century, Vikings later would convert to Christianity, and they would get rid of their pagan gods. So originally they were polytheistic, and then over time they went to being monotheistic, with Christianity. Now, of course, the other thing I need to talk about, which the Vikings were very famous for, of course, is their so-called longships, which you can see there, the so-called Osberg longship, which that short video kind of talked about, which was discovered in Norway originally. And Viking ships were these medieval type vessels that were around up to, like, I want to say 11th, 12th centuries, mostly made, of course, wooden type vessels. That, of course, you saw in the video had a very shallow draft to them. So they could basically take them anywhere. They could go pretty much up rivers. They could bank them on beaches, on the riverbed. They can, of course, go through seas and oceans and so on. And they were propelled by cloth sails, which the sails were usually made of either wool or linen. A lot of times they were dyed red. It was true about that, or white and red maybe. And then, of course, they also had oars they used as well for oar power. Hey, Matthew, what's going on this morning? Yeah, it's good you joined us. But anyway, how long were they? They varied on the amount, but average long ships were anywhere from 50 to about 100 feet. I think you look at that one right there, the Osberg longship, I think was about 70 feet long. They had an average speed of 5 to 10 knots, so maybe 12 to 13 miles an hour might be as fast. I think there may have been some that got up to 50 knots, which was pretty fast for that time period. Like later caravels or like Columbus time are actually slower than that. They are often called dragon ships because of the fact that a lot of times they would put dragon heads on the front. Like in some images like this one has a dragon head on it right there. And they all varied by size. So they had some that was like as long as 100 feet long. And so obviously the larger ships could carry more warriors or men on board as well. The Vikings, like I said, explored everywhere. They went, like I said, throughout like the North Atlantic, the Baltic Sea. They went through the Mediterranean Sea, Black Sea, Caspian Sea, in the Northern Atlantic. Yeah, the Northern Atlantic was one of the things they're kind of famous for, of course, later. So it was a very versatile ship, the so-called Viking ship. And you wouldn't see ships later that are probably faster. But another thing that's very famous about the Viking ships, if you look at that image, they're also considered one of the last types of ships. They were kind of like a work of art because it would carve into it, different carvings and things like that. So obviously the artisans that built these ships were, pretty good. And predominantly they were mostly made of wood, which was like oak. Those was the main type of wood. The Osberg longship, which you see in this image right here, was found in Norway around 1904. So that one's really considered one of the most preserved ships. They think that ship was used as some kind of what they call a funerary ship. If you know how the Vikings would take these ships, they would like bury somebody in it and set it on fire. And that's something that they were kind of known for later. So there's been several of these ships that they've found over time. But that one's, I think, considered the most preserved one that they have, which is in Norway. Right. Let me also move on to talk about, Viking expansion. I'll kind of get into and discuss where the Vikings went throughout parts of Europe. If you look at this map here, you can see how the Vikings, go from like Scandinavia, and they spread out into different areas. I think first of all, areas in red, like you see like in the 9th century, they mostly first went into parts of like Britain right here. So that was the first place they really went into, parts of Britain. And I don't know if you know about Britain, they have a lot of people that are, redheads that are kind of like in Ireland and Scotland, which, the Vikings were known for having a lot of people that had red hair or blonde as well. Just more of a lighter complexion type, hair. And so then you can also see parts of like Russia and Germany they start pushing into. Then in the 10th century, they start going into more into Russia, which is like Ukraine, really, I guess, right here. Northern France. Then you can see they go into Iceland, Greenland. Then by the 11th century, other parts of England, they go down into Italy as well. Like some of the Normans go down there, I think, eventually into what is the southern part of Italy. They're also called different names. Of course, I don't think I mentioned this previously about the Vikings, but they're also called like the Norse or Normans, Norsemen, Northmen. They're called all kinds of names because they came from Norway, so hence the name being used. And so-called Normans later, we'll talk about later, end up settling in parts of northern France. They called Normandy that because of that. Let me talk about some of the different areas that they went into, that they settled. There was an area which was, well, first of all, obviously the North Atlantic is something I'll get into later and talk about, but some of the early Vikings went from what is Denmark, where you had Danes, as they called themselves, into eastern England, and they settled in that part right there. It was called Danelaw. That was the name, which I'll show you, kind of blow this up here, but the Danelaw area was an area of eastern England, which was like right here. That's what the people in Britain called it. And it was like around the time of Alfred the Great, who was king of England, and so he was having to fight them off. And they were so powerful in that part of England that they called that region Danelaw because they had their own laws that they ruled by, and so on. There's a lot of Viking influence in, of course, England. And, of course, later the Normans came in as well and took it over. So you have that, of course, occur. Like I said, they settled in Scotland, Ireland, but they also, like I said, went into Iceland and Greenland, especially by the 10th century. They're pretty much starting to colonize that, because of the medieval warm period and all that. And there was a Viking named Eric the Red who came from Iceland originally. And he actually is the one that began the colonization of Greenland in the late 10th century. And he actually ended up coining the name because he was trying to get Viking people to go there and settle. And the only thing is that Greenland was colder than Iceland because Greenland was, built pretty much on the settlement was built on what is basically a glacier, which it still is. And so they say it was like a kind of a false advertisement by Eric the Red. And Eric the Red was called that because he had a red beard and red hair. That was the reason for his nickname. Also, he had this son named Leif Erikson, which is spelled different ways. Usually spelled with a K, I believe. Eric's son, I think I usually say. And so he was another Viking who was, I think, originally came from Iceland, and he began exploring parts of the North Atlantic. So he sailed west of or southwest of Greenland. And what Leif the Lucky is called, about that Erikson, he discovered basically what is, they think, part of North America. Discovering, exploring the North Atlantic. And so, the Vikings were one of the first Europeans to discover part of America, which, according to some epic poems, which I think were Icelandic, so-called Icelandic sagas, that kind of go through the history of the Icelandic peoples of the Vikings in the North Atlantic. They created the settlement around 1000 that was called Vinland, which is called, I think, different names. Some people say Wineland or Vineland as well. They believe it was in eastern Canada. I don't think I really have a map showing that, but I do have another map they did find later, which became kind of famous. I'll show you, which is the so-called Vinland Map, which the Vinland Map is this 15th century map they discovered later in modern times, which might prove that the Vikings may have been in parts of North America. And they think Vinland was located in what is now the northern tip of Newfoundland, close to where the Gulf of St. Lawrence is. And they called it Vinland, they believe, because when some of the early Vikings went there, they found like some kind of wild grapes growing there, which they made wine out of. Just think about that, because Vikings like wine and also mead, which is made from honey. And so this actually took place about 500 years before Columbus came to the Americas. And also John Cabot. If you know about John Cabot, he was a famous explorer for England. He was Italian, who discovered Newfoundland in 1497. So it's like almost like about 500 years later that, when this all occurs. And so after that, Vikings came in there. They began to settle that area of what was like Vinland. They were around there for about a generation or so. And there's actually a Viking settlement that they did find, which is an archaeological site discovered in the 1960s. Lands all Meadows, which is in the northern tip of Newfoundland. That's basically they think the site of where the Vikings may have been at one point. But they think the Vikings may have actually gone all the way down. There may have been all the way down to what is maybe close to Maine, Nova Scotia. They're not really sure. Were there any indigenous peoples in Greenland? Well, they talk about these people called the Skreelings, I think is what they dub them. The Skreelings, which may have been in Greenland at one point. And they think they may have been somehow related to peoples maybe in North America, like Native American cultures or similar to them as a whole. It's part of why they would abandon certain areas of that world over time, because they, I think, kept getting attacked by them or something like that. And so they later abandoned Vinland in the 11th century. They got rid of it. And I think Vikings are kind of in that area of the North Atlantic up to almost like the early part of the late Middle Ages. But over time, they did abandon it because the medieval warm period ended, which was kind of a problem. Let me also talk about a few other things about the Vikings as well. Also, the Vikings settled in other parts of Europe. If you look at this map here, they had the so-called Vikings that settled in what is northern France. They were known as the so-called Normans. They think they came out of Norway, and they crossed the North Sea and the English Channel, which I think they show a map showing it right here, where the Vikings came. I think they came this way, and then they settled right here, an area called Normandy today. And the Normans eventually grew into like a type of vassal state that was basically under the Kingdom of France. They were led by this king named Rollo, King Rollo, and he made some kind of treaty with the King of France, who was Charles III. And this culture became kind of a mix of Franco and Viking culture. It did. It was kind of a mixed culture because they kind of intermarried with people, of course, in northern France that were, French people that went back to the Franks and all that. And so they adopted Christianity, Catholicism, and so they became these Catholic French Viking people that pretty much lived in that region. And over time, they had this famous ruler of theirs named William, the Duke of Normandy, who was descended back to Rollo. He later would actually cross the English Channel. And in the 11th century, in 1066, he conquered England, the so-called Norman conquest, that they called it. The so-called Battle of Hastings, where October 14th, 1066, he conquered one of the last Anglo-Saxon rulers, and they took over England. So the Norman conquest is kind of an important area. It kind of brings in the feudalism into, of course, England at the time. And William started it was called William the Conqueror in England later, He started the so-called Norman dynasty that would reign, I guess, from the 11th to the 12th dynasties. And William's famous for his so-called Domesday Book, where he began to kind of catalog all of his land holdings throughout England and Wales, which was done in 1086. And so that's the beginning of, England becoming more powerful after that. And England for a while will control part of England and also northern France. But the dynasty that becomes really more powerful later is the Valois dynasty, sometimes called Plantagenet, which is the more common name. I'll talk about the Plantagenets later when we get more into the late Middle Ages. Then in Russia, you had the Vikings that went, from Scandinavia into like the Ukraine and into Russia, and they were seeking a lot of the trade routes with the East, like Asia, Byzantine Empire. They used their long ships to get down through the rivers of Russia, like the Don, the Dnieper, and the Volga rivers. And the people there, which were mostly Slavic-based European peoples, called them the Russ because they tended to, row those Viking ships, those long ships we talked about. And so the term Russ meant to row, like to row a ship. And so the term Russ or Russia, really the term Russia, really meant the land of the Russ. Those are the Vikings that were there. But they actually were not called Vikings themselves. They call themselves the Varangians. And I think most of them came out of like parts of like Sweden and where Finland is now. So that's basically where they were. They did have a series of states that they created throughout Russia. They are known as the Kievan Rus because they have these different states that were formed in mostly Ukraine, Western Russia, based around where Kiev and also Moscow will be later. And they were ruled by these powerful rulers like nobility. They were called either a grand prince or a grand duke. They didn't have czars yet until later, the late medieval times. You have czars come in. There were different rulers. The first two major rulers they had were related back to the Varangians, and there was like a so-called one called Rurik, who they call sometimes Prince Rurik, who they think lived in the late 9th century. They think he was the one that founded the so-called Rurik dynasty, which is what they call the dynasties of Russia up through medieval times. It goes all the way to the czars like Ivan IV, the Terrible. I think he's one of the last ones at the end. And Oleg was another one that was famous. He was a 10th century Viking Russian ruler that was descended back to the Vikings. And also Vladimir the First, or sometimes called Vladimir the Great, who lived late 10th, early 11th century, was considered one of the greatest of the Viking leaders that was well known. And he's very important if you study about Vladimir. They call him Vladimir, I think is how they say it in Russia. Vladimir was known for famously converting all the Russians to Christianity, which he did. I think sometime at the turn of the 11th century. And if you know about it, they eventually adopted Orthodox Christianity from the Byzantine Empire because of their influences. And if you know about Russia, Russia was heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire. That's where they get their language from. Like Russian Cyrillic, as you know, came from Greek. Their religion came from pretty much the Byzantines. A lot of the architecture of, you ever seen like St. Basil's Cathedral, which is in Moscow? It's got those onion-shaped domes, which of course go back to Byzantine architecture. So yeah, Russia over time kind of becomes this third Rome. They sometimes talk about as they evolve into a major state up through medieval to modern times. But they did have some kind of supposedly Viking influences from a long time ago that were there. But mostly the people of Russia are predominantly Slavic, with other peoples that come in later. They may have, possibly. I know they could beach them like on land, but yeah, that may have been possible, yes, as far as I know. But anyway, so let me go ahead and move on. We need to, of course, talk about as well the Crusades that come in, because Crusades, of course, were a major event that also happens in the Middle Ages. Pretty much the High Middle Ages. It's one of the peak events that we have. And, the Crusades, as you can see, are a series of long campaigns that were fought between the Christians and Muslims in, of course, the Middle East. You can see there they mostly fought over the Holy Land. They wanted to get back the Holy Land, where Jesus lived a long time ago. They thought that should be Christian lands and not under, Islamic rule. So I think going back like the 7th, 8th century, pretty much the Islamic empires had taken it over and conquered that region, especially around Palestine, Syria, and part of Turkey is at the time. And these were a series of, like I said, they were a series of military campaigns to get back, of course, the Holy Land. And they happened mostly between the 11th and 13th centuries. I think the last ones kind of go up to like the 9th Crusade or whatever, but they actually did have crusades that went up to like the 14th century when they were fighting like the 100 Years' War and all that. Who did they mostly fight against? Predominantly the Seljuk Turks. The Turks were these Caucasian peoples. They came out of Central Asia, a place around where Turkestan is, which is way up there above Afghanistan, kind of between Afghanistan and what is, I guess, Russia today. And so they entered the Middle East, like Turkey, Syria, began taking it over, and they converted to Sunni Islam. They became Muslim, if you know about this. And the Ottoman Turks later that were kind of like their cousins that kind of come in and also conquer that region as well. And so because of these new people coming in, they were very warlike, and it caused a lot of strife between Christians that were in that region at the time, the remnants of the Byzantine Empire, which I told you before, is shrinking. Apparently in the 1090s, the Byzantine emperor named Alexius Comnenus I, he asked for help from the West. He appealed to them for military aid. And the Pope at the time was this Pope named Pope Urban II. And so he started making these speeches, like sermons, I guess, to people in the West to try to come to their aid. And so that's what actually caused the Crusades to actually occur. And so basically you get these Christian warriors, that are knights that go to the Middle East to fight, and they're known as Crusaders, which the term Crusader, there's different translations of it, but it means either one who takes up the cross or one who's signed by the cross, or some kind of translation similar to that. At first, a lot of them fought for, military glory and to maybe get saved or whatever. But as you know, over time, they mostly fought over to get wealth and land. That's one of the things that, of course, came out of it, of course, later. I do have a map showing you, by the way, the different, crusades that happen over time. So I can kind of blow this up right here. You can see I got at least the four main crusades I'll kind of mention about, which are really the most famous ones that happened over time. Most of them came from like several countries, which were France, Germany, and England, and also, I guess, parts of like rest of Europe. And the first crusade was really the most successful one. I think I've got a slide here kind of showing you some of the crusades that they had that were famous. That was the first one, 1096 to 1099. This was your first crusade that took place. That one was the most successful one because they retook, Jerusalem. But it wasn't just that. They took back also parts of like southern Turkey. They took over Syria. They took over pretty much most of Lebanon. They took over the area that we call, Israel now, which I think back then they kind of called it Palestine, was the common term that they used for that area. And the first crusade, there were actually two participants in it. I don't know if you really know about all this, but at first there wasn't really knights that came first. They had all these like lower class people like serfs or whatever that came first. Were like Christians that were led by this man named Peter the Hermit, you may have heard of, and it was unsuccessul. A lot of them, as they got there, got killed by basically the Turks, and so they didn't make it. And then later, they had what they call the Prince's Crusade. This is the first crusade still. That one was more successful, where various knights, led mostly by, I think, lower nobility, France, Normans, Germans, and of course Italians. Normans, I guess, from England, basically France. And that one was more successful. It resulted in the recapture, of course, of Jerusalem, which you can see was on July the 15th, 1099. As you know, they would tend to massacre people. Anybody that was like kind of like non-Christian or kind of seen as kind of a foreign Christian, they sometimes tended to kill them. So Jews, Muslims were often massacred by them as they conquered different parts as they went eastward, more or less. So that was the so-called First Crusade that they have. I'll get to the other crusades a little later about that. I did want to talk about the fact that after the First Crusade, they formed these states afterwards in the region, which I'll throw on the screen here, which were referred to as being called Crusader States. Well, they formed their own states, which were kind of like these Latin states that the Catholic knights all founded. They are called different names. They were called either Crusader States or another common name they're called, which was Outremer States. Outremer was a term that they used, I think in Latin, that meant overseas states, because they were overseas from the rest of Europe. And there were four major Crusader states that were founded: County of Edessa, County of Tripoli, Principality of Antioch, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. All four of those there. That's where you get the term county from. Like some countries have counties, that break up their state, because a county is something that was originally ruled by a count. It's the name. So the counties were obviously ruled by counts, and then a principality was ruled by a prince. And then, of course, the only one that was really ruled by a king was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was actually ruled by some nobility that came from France. I think Baldwin the First, I believe, was one of the first rulers and founders of it. A lot of them relate back to the Knights Templars, which I'll get to in a second about them. And it was the most powerful of the different Crusader states. By the way, it lasted the longest. I think down to, I want to say, about 1291, parts of it were still around. So yeah, those kind of states that they broke up. Then, of course, what happened as well was they also began to form these military orders, which were kind of well known in not just the Middle East, but in parts of medieval Europe. They formed these Catholic knights, Catholic order of knights throughout the region or the Crusades. Knights Templar, of course, one of the most famous. That's well known. The so-called Hospitallers were famous. The so-called Teutonic Order from Germany was also well known. And the Knights Templar, or just Templars for short, was originally found in 1119 in Jerusalem. As you know, they get their name, the Templars get their name from the fact that they were the original headquarters of the Knights Templar was on the Temple Mount, where the old temple used to be in Jerusalem. And they think where the Dome of the Rock is. And so quite often they were called the Knights of the Temple. That's what the name meant, basically. But over time, they kind of shortened it to being called just Templars for short. They were known for their Red Cross on their uniforms and on their shields. And as you know, the Red Cross is some kind of symbol that was later used by, like the Red Cross organization, kind of a variation of it. Although it's kind of not square like the one that they use today, like that one. But I think I've got images later of some of the different Templars. I think there's some right here showing the flag on the bottom right, right there. And then, of course, you can see the knight with a shield, with the actual shield with the cross on it also as well. The Knights Templar, by the way, were very wealthy. I think they practically started the banking industry in Europe. It's something they're known for. They owned a lot of land, and they were considered really the best medieval knights, overall. So they were kind of like crack troops, shock troops, of that period. They're around up to the late Middle Ages before the French kind of stamped them out, though. Also, they had what they call the Knights of St. John, which were known as the so-called Hospitallers, because they established hospitals throughout, like, the region, to help out people that were sick or pilgrims that came there and became ill, etc. They had a white cross instead of red. And then you had the Teutonic Order, of course, from Germany, the German Knights, which had a black cross, which was often called later the so-called Iron Cross, which, the Germans later used that as a medal that they would give soldiers that were, real brave in battle, etc. They had other crusades as well. The Second Crusade, you can see, happened about 1147 to 48 or 49. And what happened was one of the first, if you know much about the Middle East with the Crusades and all that, the County of Edessa had been one of the first states founded, the Crusader States. It was also the first to fall, which it was. And what happened was the Seljuk Turks conquered it. And so kings in Europe went on this crusade to get it back. Louis VII of France, Conrad III, who was the Holy Roman Emperor of Germany, they all tried, but it failed. They failed to get it back. And so that territory, which I think was mostly in part of Syria, was basically pretty much fallen to the Turks. There was a deal on the way back, which I did want to mention about, which is kind of famous. Actually, not on the way back, on the way there. There were some crusaders that apparently came from England, and they conquered Portugal, where Lisbon is today. And that's how Portugal got founded. So I guess they say the Crusades helped to create, part of Portugal originally, maybe part of Spain too at the time. Then you got the Third Crusade. You see in that list on the bottom. Third Crusade, 1189 to 1192. That one is considered one of the most famous of the Crusades. It was caused by Saladin or Salah ad-Din, who was a very famous Muslim general and sultan in the Middle East. He, of course, is really probably considered one of the most famous, I guess, of the villains that fought, the Crusaders. There he is right there, Saladin. He was one of the first sultans, by the way, to rule over Egypt and Syria, especially Egypt. And he had a dynasty called the Ayyubid dynasty, which he helped found. And Saladin's forces were instrumental in 1187 in destroying what was the majority of the army of the kingdom of Jerusalem. There was a battle called the Battle of Hattin, sometimes called the Horns of Hattin, if you know about this, which happened on the date of July 4th, 1187. And a good majority of their army was wiped out. And so Saladin was able to march on Jerusalem and lay siege to it and took it in 1187. And so this brought on the Third Crusade, which people in Europe later called it the so-called King's Crusade, as they nickname it, because of the fact that all these different kings in Europe eventually went on to fight in it directly. They actually came from Europe and led their forces in battle. And these are the three main rulers that were involved that were from Europe. You had Richard I, who everybody's heard of, called the Lionheart, who was about king for about 10 years in England. But he was mostly on campaign throughout most of his reign. Philip II, also called Philip Augustus of France, who was a big rival of Richard, They hated each other. And then Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor of Germany, usually called Frederick the First or Frederick Barbarossa the First as well. And out of the different kings, the one that was the most famous was Richard the First, the Lionheart you see there, died in 1199. And he was king only for about 10 years, about roughly. But Richard was the most successful fighting against Saladin. His most pivotal battle was the Battle of Jaffa in August of 1192, where his forces decisively defeated Saladin's forces in northern Israel, taking Jaffa, also taking the city of Acre as well. And it led to a negotiated truce between both sides, where there was a 3-year truce that followed, where they allowed pilgrims to actually visit the Middle East without getting harmed, like the Holy Land and all that. And so that he was really considered one of the most famous of the different Crusader kings that was involved in these wars that kept going. So yeah, that was somewhat semi-successful, that one. You can see the territory, by the way, that they took. Of course, they don't have as much left, but you can see most of the land. They have part of Syria up here that they control. They've got, pretty much from southern Lebanon all the way down to northern Israel. All these areas are pretty much controlled, at that point, close to about 1,200. But over time, it starts shrinking, more or less, is what will eventually happen. I'll expand it more. You can see it right here, but here's kind of an area right here. So yeah, Antioch, Tripoli, Beirut, Tyre, Acre, Jaffa, all these areas, of course, were controlled by them. And a lot of the Crusaders built castles, by the way, up and down the coastline here. But Jerusalem, of course, was not taken back by Richard. And so a lot of people felt, disappointed about that. Now, I did want to talk about this other crusade they had as well, which they had a bunch of these so-called later crusades that come in, which I guess the two I'll talk about the most is the Fourth Crusade and the Sixth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade, if you know about it, was kind of a crusade that kind of was bad. It was like really one of these crusades that was a failed crusade and had a lot of negative results from it. And the Fourth Crusade was actually supposed to be a crusade where they were going to attack, the Holy Land again and try to take Jerusalem. And I think they were supposed to come up through Egypt from the south and take Jerusalem from that direction. But of course, it ended up not happening that way. And what ended up happening, if you know about it, they ended up sacking what is Constantinople in 1204. It was a very famous event that happened during the Crusades. And why did the Crusaders end up attacking Constantinople? Well, there's different theories on this, but a lot of it had to do with the fact that the Crusades went from being this whole, holy war to being about making money, seizing land. And so I think as they conquered attacked the parts of the Holy Land, Middle East, they found out that people there were pretty impoverished, how much wealth they were gaining from it. But the Byzantine Empire was very wealthy. And they also resented the Byzantine Empire because they weren't Catholic. They were Orthodox Christians, which they never trusted them, about this. Oh, and then they say the Crusaders were indebted to the Italians because they were kind of helping to equip them and shipping them over and stuff like that. And so they owed a lot of debt to them. That was another reason, too, I guess, why they need to do it as well. So, like I said, in 1204 CE, they attacked basically into the city of Constantinople. By the way, it was only one of 2 times that the city of Constantinople's fortifications have been breached. 1204, and the other one, the Ottoman Empire conquered the remnants of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. Happened in April, and probably close to Easter, bad time. And Anyway, they believe it caused like an East-West schism, which was often called later the so-called Great Schism in Christianity. The Great Schism was basically where the Catholic and Orthodox churches split apart. They never got back together. And some people confuse it with the papal schism that they have later in the Catholic Church, where they had two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon. It's not the same thing. A lot of people confuse that. I don't know why exactly. Those two are two different things, because the papal schism was in the 14th, 15th centuries, 1378 to 1417. And so it's not the same thing. The so-called, they often call it the Western Schism. I think is what they call the papal schism. And the Great Schism is the split between the Catholic Orthodox churches. So, but yeah, they never got back together, and I think there's talk of trying to get them back together. And they got on friendly terms, but I don't know if that'll ever happen, more or less. Now, they did have later crusades. Like there's one here. I'll probably skip the fifth one. That one was not that famous. That was a failed crusade. But they did have one. That was the Sixth Crusade, which was led by Frederick II, who I believe was the son of Frederick I, Frederick Barbarossa. And that one was an interesting crusade. It was actually gotten through diplomacy because I believe in Egypt under the Turks, there was some kind of rebellion that broke out. And so the Crusaders were kind of able to take advantage of that. And so the Sultan of Egypt kind of let him take it, and he couldn't do anything about it. And so they re-seized it, but I think it fell within a few decades after that. So briefly, they did take back Jerusalem, but it later fell again. They did have this crusade that's kind of weird. I did want to mention. Of course, you can see those other ones they had later. Didn't really work out either. In fact, the 7th, 8th Crusades were crusades done by Louis IX. You may have heard of him, St. Louis. I don't know if you've been to New Orleans, where they have the famous St. Louis Cathedral. It's named after him, Louis IX. He had some failed crusades that didn't work out. They also had a 9th Crusade by the English. That one failed too. As well. They did have some crusades that went into the 1300s that kind of continue afterwards, believe it or not. But none of them were successful. They start kind of petering out overall. They had this bizarre one you may have heard of called the Childrens Crusade, which was in the early 13th century, I think 1212. And in France and Germany, they had a bunch of Christian children that basically thought that they could march on the Middle East. And then if they could convert all the Muslims to Christianity, they could then take it all back. And the crusade never worked out. A lot of them got to some of the ports in Italy, and the ports also in what is France. And they got sold into slavery, if you know about this. And you may have heard of this story called the Pied Piper, which was big in the Middle Ages. The Pied Piper story, I heard about it. And they think that there was a man named Nicholas of Cologne who was involved with the Children's Crusade, and they think he's the actual origin of where the Pied Piper story came from. So I think he was an older guy that kind of tried to get people to do this, but it failed. Let me talk also about the Crusades. Like why did the Crusades fail? Well, you can see here that there was different reasons for it. Obviously, from the first attempt, it got weaker after that. So they didn't really put enough, I think, military force into it, like money and men really to really do what they could have, I think. And then obviously the interest went from, a holy war, which it originally was, to basically about money, about getting material goods, about trade, and I think also kind of trying to seize land. You can see they also basically tried to steal whatever they could from the Byzantine Empire, Islamic empires, and it helped to basically cause the decline of the Byzantine Empire even more. It also caused a lot of animosity between Islam and Christianity. I think that's part of why I think they're trying to attack us now, like in the West, because they feel like it's like the Crusades in reverse. more or less. Some people see it as that overall. But yeah, it really helped to weaken Christianity in the East, is one of the things that it actually did. It becomes more weaker and weaker later. So you don't have as many Christians that live obviously in the East anymore after that time period. It also weakened the papal power. So the popes in like the Catholic Church in Europe become less powerful because a lot of the early Crusades, first 4 or 5 or whatever, were heavily influenced by the church. So like if a king did want to go on a crusade, he could excommunicate you. But after that, they're less powerful. And so that leads to a lot of these powers in Europe becoming more powerful, like England, France, Germany, the so-called Holy Roman Empire, become more powerful. And over time, they're going to become more secular, is one of the things that will kind of come about. Then also in Italy, the other thing too that became kind of important as well, the Italians became very wealthy off of the Crusades. They discovered all this Asian trade that's coming from like China and parts of the East. The caravan routes, the so-called Silk Road. So they basically, you get cities like Florence and so on that become very powerful and wealthy. That will later, lead into the Renaissance that will, of course, will follow, which I'll talk about probably, of course, later in another lecture coming up. So yeah, the Crusades, they did not work out at all in pretty much within, I guess a century or two after it got started. They lost most of the territory that they had gained. And so I guess that's why Israel, as a state of Israel today that's there in the middle, is kind of controversial because for a long time it was territory that was controlled by Muslims, and that's why some people don't like that. But anyway, but there were Jews living there too at the same time when the Crusades were going on. And a lot of them were killed by them because they weren't Christian, just like the Muslims. All right, so that's it pretty much roughly lecture-wise today. Like I said, later in the week, I'll get, of course, more into talking about the late Middle Ages. I'm going to talk on Wednesday coming up later I'll talk about the invasion of the Mongols. The Mongols come in kind of at the beginning of the late Middle Ages. We'll get into them. I'll talk about the Timurid, I think, Empire a little bit, kind of as a remnant of that afterwards. Then I'll get into the peak things that happened, of course, in the Middle Ages. We've got the outbreak of the bubonic plague, sometimes called the Black Death, which ravished Europe in the 14th century. You've got millions killed by it. I'll kind of get into that. I'll talk about the 100 Years' War, which the 100 Years' War was one of the most devastating, violent wars of the Middle Ages. In fact, it's probably the most famous and longest war of the Middle Ages, where France and England fought it out for control. And then I'll get into the Renaissance as well, which is really the last major event of the Middle Ages we got, which leads into modern times. So we'll get into that. I'll talk about the different artists that were kind of famous, like Michelangelo and all those other different artists like Da Vinci. So that's it for today. I don't think we have any other questions right now, looks like in the live stream. But as you know, if you have any questions, of course, later about the live stream, this lecture, let me know. You can leave me any kind of comments, questions, of course, about that lecture. Before I go, don't forget, I did have some assignments I think I had that I talked about previously that we had. I think there's a bunch of them. I know we still got out the later Roman history. I gave you that one because I don't want to lecture much. I don't want to give you a quiz much on that in the exam. So I want to kind of mostly have our final on the Middle Ages. So try to wrap that up by Friday. Final vocab due next week. And then the Veterans Project is due, I told you, on May 1st, if you're doing that project, more or less. So that's it for the week. I hope y'all take care and have a great, final week, going into the finals. Start preparing, for the finals coming up. I'll try to see if I can have a review, by the way, those that have to take the final. I think on Friday, I might do it on a Friday probably is what I'll have to do. I'll probably review over various study guide questions I have, but I'm probably going to try to do that towards the final. but you might be able to start early if you want. Of course, the final exam starting this Wednesday. So y'all take care. If you have any other questions, you can email me, of course, anytime, of course, you want. So I'll see you later in the week, of course, for more of the Middle Ages.